From 1917 on, the United States taxpayers were the total support of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union. In fact, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, which was the central bank of the entire Federal Reserve System, most of its effort during the 1920s was dedicated to shoring up the collapsing communist system. See, the communist system collapsed almost immediately after the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, because the workers and peasants said, look, we own everything, we don't have to take care of everything because it's ours. And there was a story about a peasant who burned down a huge forest. And so they said to this peasant, why did you burn down the forest? He said, because it's ours now. We can do whatever we want. So they burned it down. And of course, they stopped growing wheat. So Herbert Hoover, who later became known as an anti-communist because he saved communism, you have a lot of these paradoxes in this kind of work. I have to tell you, you have to have a very flexible reasoning capacity, because Herbert Hoover became world famous as an anti-communist because he saved communism. And if you could figure that out, tell me. I'd like to know. And in fact, he set up the Hoover Institute at Stanford, California, called the Hoover Institute of War, Peace, and Revolution. And today it's very active. In fact, the whole Reagan administration in 1980 was pulled out of the Hoover Institute at Stanford University. And these were called the neoconservatives. And Reagan had a neoconservative administration. And they were all out of Hoover Institute, and they were all old-line socialists. So the great Reagan Revolution, anti-communist revolution, Reagan is standing up there saying the Soviet Union is the evil empire, and his whole administration was socialists behind him. He didn't know that, of course. Reagan would have known a socialist if one came up and bit him on the leg, but he was a Hollywood actor, and a very good one. And of course, his presidency was the culmination of his entire acting career. He was the best speaker, the most charismatic president we've ever had and ever will have, as a matter of fact. And so he simply played his role to perfection, and he was very good at it. And meanwhile, these neoconservative socialists ran the whole country.
Sorry, try not to cover your mic with your pad, please.
Oh, don't cover it.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, all right. So the Reagan Revolution was really a neoconservative revolution in which the socialists ran the country to suit themselves, and they ran up an enormous deficit, which created more interest for the bankers. And of course, this all went back to Thanksgiving week of 1910, as I discovered at the Library of Congress. I went to the Library of Congress and started digging out some things back in 1948. And I found that there had been a secret meeting of the bankers at Jekyll Island in 1910. And these were the most important bankers in New York. They got on a train in Hoboken to go down to Brunswick, Georgia. And Brunswick is a very interesting name because Brunswick was the origin of the Hanover family, the Dukes of Hanover, who became the kings of England in 1700. And they became the kings of England by some faked genealogy, which they had an obliging scholar draw up for them. And so they went to England to become the kings of England. They didn't even speak English. The first three Georges of Hanover dynasty in England didn't speak English and didn't see why they should bother to learn it, because German was their language. And so here you had the leaders of Britain speaking only German. And finally, I think they did learn some English. And of course, today, Queen Elizabeth does speak English, but it took a while. Because these people have so much power, they do whatever they want. They say, I'm not going to bother to speak English in London. Let the English people learn German, you know. They want to talk to me. So that was the Hanover dynasty, which happened to be the Illuminati and Freemasonry originated in the Hanover province. And Brunswick, Georgia, was named after the Brunswick Hanover family. And so this is where these bankers, their train went to Brunswick, Georgia. Then they went across the inlet to the Jekyll Island, which they had bought a few years earlier and made a private enclave. And the residents of Jekyll Island at that time comprised 1/6 of the wealth of the entire world. So these people were not Johnny-come-latelys. They knew what they were doing. And so they had their private meeting, and they got rid of all the servants on Jekyll Island and for this private meeting. And they brought in new servants, and they agreed they would only call each other by their first names. Paul Warburg was Paul, and Nelson Aldrich was Nelson. And ever after, they were known as the First Name Club because they only used first names. And all these people agreed they would never mention the fact that they had ever been on Jekyll Island. Because what they did there was to secretly write the Federal Reserve Act with our central bank plan. Now, they had been trying to get a central bank in the United States since 1787. And the first Bank of the United States, which was a central bank, was enacted over the opposition of Thomas Jefferson. And in my book, I quote Thomas Jefferson's opposition to it. He was just a farmer in Virginia, but he had an understanding of international banking, which is absolutely incredible. So he put down all the list of why you should oppose the central bank. But Alexander Hamilton persuaded George Washington to approve the plans for the first Bank of the United States. So Washington approved it. But then when Jefferson became president and the first Bank of the United States charter came up for renewal, Jefferson, of course, this was his moment. He refused to renew it. Well, the Bank of England, which actually controlled the central bank, was very annoyed. So they declared war on the United States. Now, when you go to school, you probably taught that the War of 1812 was caused by the fact that British frigates stopped American ships on the high seas and took off their crews and put them to work on their own ships. It's called impressing. Well, that did happen, but that wasn't the reason for the war whatsoever. The war was simply a punitive act against the United States to try to defeat them and bring them back in as a British colony because of they refused to renew the charter of the first Bank of the United States. Well, and of course you had this war in which, of course, Canada was on the side of the British during the War of 1812, and they actually burned Washington, but we survived. And so then they set up a second central bank called the Second Bank of the United States. And along comes the hero of the War of 1812, General Andrew Jackson. And as president, he said, "By God, you are a gang of vipers, and I will root you out." He had righteous anger against these bankers. So he pulled the government deposits out of the Second Bank of the United States. Well, of course, it immediately collapsed in 1836. That was the end of the second central bank that we had in this country. So in revenge, the Bank of England issued an order that no paper would be honored from the United States. All American securities, stocks, bonds were worthless as of that date. So we had our first financial collapse in the United States, the Panic of 1837. And it was caused simply as a punitive action because when you make the bankers mad, they don't sit around and brood. They do something about it. Like they murder Lincoln, they murder Kennedy, and so forth. And so they put the entire United States into financial collapse. Well, then the agents of the Rothschilds bought up these American securities for 1 cent on the dollar, and you created the first big fortunes in the United States. Our first millionaires were all created by the Panic of 1837, and they more or less became the agents of the Bank of England in the United States because their fortunes were entirely due to the outside influence. And of course, the American people had no idea what was going on. They just knew we suddenly had a new class of millionaires, and the fact that they were all foreign agents never dawned on anybody. And so it's gone that way ever since. I have been meaning to write a monetary history of the United States, showing that everything that happened in the States and everything that happens here in Canada is engineered by the bankers because their program comes first. The people come last. The only thing the people have to worry about is how to pay the interest on these enormous debts which the bankers create out of nothing. That's it. That's your problem. You've got to come up with that interest. Before you buy food or anything else, you've got to pay that interest. Because you see, it's a moral obligation. You should pay your debts.